Welcome back, one and all, to the latest edition of the Future So Right podcast. I'm your host, Pete Beal. This is a Green Flame Press production, and I really appreciate you joining me today. It's been a little bit since we've had an episode, been a lot going on with me in the meantime. I released my second book back in May, The Throne of Thornata, available now. Of course, I'm obligated to tell you that there will be a link in the description below if you're interested in purchasing that. So when I was trying to determine what I wanted to talk about today, what I've been doing lately is I've been listening to a lot of lectures by various authors. And maybe even lectures might not necessarily be the right term, but it's the closest thing that I can think of, where they essentially sit down and maybe they're talking about all of their work in general, or they're talking about a specific book. But they sit down and they essentially describe their writing process, why they ultimately decided to craft the story in the way that they did, the various decisions they made, and overall just discussing their process, their writing process, their creative process. And I really love these types of talks. Now, maybe I'm strange. Maybe I'm the only person that enjoys things like this. But if the talks are out there, I'd assume there's an audience of some kind. So it got me thinking a little bit about my own process. And it's something I don't necessarily think about a lot. It just sort of happens to me while I'm writing. However, I thought it would be fun to sort of do a dive into my first book, The Path of the Rawl Wielder, and sort of work my way through the book and talk a little bit about the creative process. Why did I make the decisions I made? Why did I take the story in the directions I took it? So on and so forth. I think this could be a lot of fun because I originally drafted this book for the first time, I think it was 2014 or 2015. And then obviously I went through multiple revisions and rounds of edits in between then and the release in last September of 2021. But I thought it would be interesting to revisit. It would be some fun for me, and maybe it would be a little bit informative for you. Maybe it would make you ask some questions about your own process, why you go the direction you go when working on your projects. So that's going to be the theme of the episode today. I'm going to go through the book. I am going to come right out and warn you there will probably be at least some minor spoilers. If you have not read the book and you have an interest in reading the book, you may want to come back to this episode at a later time. I'm also going to be going through this essentially chapter by chapter, so if you're one of, well, I have to put it like this, one of the people like me that would enjoy this kind of thing, what you could decide to do is pick up the book and read one chapter and then come back and hear my thoughts on that chapter and then go on like that. I'm probably the only kind of sicko that would enjoy something like that, though. But either way, I hope you find the discussion enjoyable, hopefully a little bit helpful. Hopefully, at the very least, it can make you think a little bit about the writing process and do sort of a deeper dive into your own process. So, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. So we're going to dive right into Chapter 1. I have a copy of the book here to jog my memory if I need it, but truth be told, I've been through this thing so many times, I think I could do this from memory pretty effectively. But we open up right out of the gate with our main character, Adele, who will be the main character for this 3-book set. Now this is a young man who is 16 years old, and he makes a living on a shipping barge in a place which is broadly known as the Empire, and specifically he is in the province of Thornata, which is one of the northernmost provinces in the Empire. And so he works on this shipping barge, essentially delivering goods by river between the various cities in the province. He does this at this young age because he doesn't have any direct family of his own left. His mother was his last living relative, and she died after an illness. One of her friends was the captain of a shipping barge, Boyd, and he took the young man under his wing and gave him a place to live and a job and pays him fairly for his work. It was really important to me for the main character of this particular series to be sort of an ordinary person. And what do I mean by that? I wanted to explore in this series essentially how far a normal person like you or I might go when pressed into extreme circumstances. Now, of course, Adele ends up not being a 100% normal person. However, personality-wise, he's very similar to any normal person of his age range that you might meet on the street, right? This is obviously a medieval type setting, so he doesn't have, an iPhone or play little video games or anything like that. But he shares a lot of similar traits. So the first few pages are sort of meant to introduce him, give you a little bit of a physical description. I gotta be honest with you, I hate physical descriptions of characters in books. So it's something I always struggle with because I know a lot of people want them, but I hate writing them, I hate reading them. So I'm always more of the mind of give you the minimum and let you use your imagination from there. So the opening pages, we talk a little bit about Adele, and the main thing we're focusing on is his view of the world around him. This is their first big shipping trip of the spring after the rivers have thawed. They are sailing along a river through the Bonner Mountains, and he's just sort of taking in the scenery, appreciating what he gets to do for his living, and he has sort of a sense of wanderlust. He wants to get out and have adventures. He wants to get out and see the whole world. He, of course, gets interrupted from this pretty quickly by Captain Boyd, who informs him that there's potentially danger for bandit attacks coming up as they pass through the mountains. This, of course, becomes the inciting incident, for those of you that like terms like that, for the story that takes place to follow. It was important to me to get the inciting incident out of the way right out of the gate in Chapter 1. I just wanted to get down to business with this. So essentially there are a group of outlaws called the Hoyt who have been preying on shipping barges and trading caravans and essentially stealing their goods or their money, and oftentimes brutalizing or killing the unfortunate souls who are transporting these goods. We don't know a lot about the Hoyt at this point, so I'm not going to go into further details. That will, of course, come later. So Adele, being a young man, is asked to bring up the weapons for the crew to defend the ship, but the captain is quite aware that he's only 16 years old, and it's very important to Captain Boyd to keep Adele safe. So he orders Adele to stay in the captain's box, which is a more shielded area, and his job is to steer the ship if they do come under attack, where he's as safe as he can possibly be. Sure enough, the ship does come under attack by the Hoyt, and what they've done is they've positioned themselves on cliffs as the ship passes through this mountain range, where they're essentially raining arrows down on the ship from above. They're just trying to kill everyone aboard the ship. They don't talk to anyone on the ship or anything like that. They just open fire. During the course of this, Adele sees one of his crewmates killed right in front of him, which is a key portion of the inciting incident, I would say. For his character development going forward, he needed to see that. He needed to have that sort of visual... He needed a visual example of what these people were capable of and what these people were willing to do. So he sees this crewmate, Dunal, die right in front of him, gets shot and falls off the ship. The ship eventually makes it through the canyon where the attack is taking place. However, several more crewmen have died or been injured, and they continue on their way. Adele is obviously quite shaken by this, and the captain recognizes this and gives him a little bit of busy work to keep his mind occupied Now, for the characters, that's pretty much it. But what I was trying to do with this particular scene as a writer conveying something to the reader is I wanted the scene to feel a little odd. Okay, so these bandits open fire on this ship. They don't say anything, and they're in a position up on these cliffs where even if they do manage to kill everybody aboard the ship, what exactly are they going to do? They can't steal the ship or its goods from the cliff above. So it's meant to be a little bit of an ominous feeling for the reader. Well, they didn't just open fire for the fun of it. They might be vindictive, but they wouldn't do that. So what's the plan there? There has to be more to come, right? And in the back of their minds, I think the characters realize this as well. But that was more so a message from me to the reader that, okay, they survived this little round of the attack, but it's not over yet. So, chapter 1 is a pretty short chapter. I wanted to get into it. How many pages was chapter 1? Let me see. Only 10 pages long. I really just kind of wanted to get into things and get moving and get the story going. And it continues in chapter 2 from pretty much the point after the attack. Once the dust has settled, they're continuing to sail on their shipping mission, essentially, trying to get their goods where they've been paid to go. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it's not going to be smooth sailing from there on out. So that was the end of chapter 1. Let's get into chapter 2. So moving into chapter 2, we pick up the next morning with Adele waking from a nightmare. He's essentially tossed and turned all night, unable to sleep because of the images of what he's just seen going through his head. Captain Boyd understands this, and the two have a brief conversation. Boyd is essentially an ex-Navy sailor. He used to sail in the Imperial Navy, and so he's seen quite a bit in his life, and he tries to reassure Adele that, the images and the nightmares and such will pass in time, but he's also a man who's seen quite a bit of things, and he knows deep down that you never 100% move past something like this. So they go about their day, and they're through the mountains now, and now they're out in this open plain area. They're on their way to their destination, the city of Karlstag is where they're heading. Are they going to Karlstag or Karlskag? This is a bit of world building on my part. I gave these twin cities really similar names because I'm an idiot. Because I thought, they're like twin cities. It's cute for them to have similar names, but I always get them mixed up. It was Karlskag they were heading to, the northernmost city on the inland Moyi Sea. So, sorry, that was a bit of a sidetrack there. You'll also find a lot of the names of the city in this province start with K's. It was something my editor actually pointed out to me, and there actually is a canonical reason for that, but I'm not going to dive into that quite now. Maybe I'll do that later. So they're traveling across these more open plains. There's a lot of fields, some trees, and as they're going down the river, they spot an obstruction in the river ahead. And as I'm sure you can surmise, these are more of the Hoyt bandits. And what they've essentially done is they've blockaded the river with smaller boats, but they've also they've used a large chain attached to trees on either side of the river to essentially assure that even a bigger ship like this barge can't just ram its way through. They're going to have to stop for this blockade. So now it's quite obvious to the reader and to the characters that the bandits back in the mountains were only the first stage of the attack, meant to weaken them so that this second group can come aboard their vessel, take what they wish, and ultimately do what they wish with anyone that's still alive. There's a brief discussion between the Hoyt bandits and Captain Boyd, where essentially the Hoyt are saying, hey, give us what we want off your ship or else. And Boyd essentially sees through this. He realizes that even if he were to give them everything he has, after what they had done in the canyon, it's highly unlikely that they're going to let anyone live. So he essentially gives them a big middle finger and proceeds onward. He opens fire on the Hoyt open fire on the barge, and once again Adele is regulated to the captain's box to try to keep him as safe as possible, but things are looking quite bleak. The crew of the shipping barge is quite outnumbered. More of them are dying by the second as the Hoyt continue to fire on them, and there's really no escape. So this makes Adele quite angry, as one can imagine. He's of course terrified, but he's also very angry. And he's very angry because it's sort of setting into him that himself and all of these men that he's grown close to over the past few years are going to die because these Hoyt bandits essentially just want to take what they have. And the injustice of it is just so upsetting to him. He's just so angry. And he's sitting here steering the ship, and they're getting closer and closer to this Hoyt blockade, and he's getting angrier and angrier. And it feels to him almost subconsciously as if the river beneath him is starting to roil up, almost like the river is angry too. And that's a bit of a crazy thought. And he steps out of the captain's box, and Boyd's screaming at him to get back in, but he can't even register anything that's going on around him. He's so angry. And he steps right out onto the deck of the barge and faces down the Hoyt. And the entire time he's doing this, the river is continuing to surge and continuing to just thrash and throw the ships around, which is quite odd because the waters were quite calm only a few minutes earlier. And the thought comes into his head, is this happening because of me? And even in his own mind in that moment, he thinks that sounds insane. But the river is continuing to match his emotions. And so almost subconsciously he's thinking, I wish I could just destroy these Hoyt ships. I wish I could get rid of them. They deserve to die. We don't deserve to die. These bandits are scum. They just want to take from us. And as he gets angrier and angrier, and as he directs that anger more directly at the Hoyt, the river ultimately creates almost like a tidal wave that completely just rips these smaller Hoyt boats to shreds. And it has so much power behind this. Essentially, it's an attack that he's making subconsciously against them, that it just rips the chains free from the trees, and their barge goes right through this boat graveyard where he's just completely ripped these boats to shreds. And he's standing there on the deck of the ship completely flabbergasted. He doesn't even know what just happened. In his mind, he's wondering, did I just die and I'm having some sort of hallucination? And then the fatigue sets in, like he had just been through some sort of horrible physical ordeal, even though all he had really done was walk up to the front of the barge. And before he can say a word, or before any of his remaining shipmates or the captain can say anything to him, he just collapses and falls asleep, just essentially blacks out right there on the deck of the ship. And that's how that chapter closes out. So that was our first glimpse into what this story is eventually going to become, which it's going to become very largely centered on Adele and this power that he possesses that he had no idea that he possesses, which he just discovered quite by accident. So, going forward, the characters now have to deal with the fact that he has this power and they need to figure out what it is, what they're going to do about it. And after what just happened with the Hoyt on the river, I think it would be safe to say that they're not going to forget something like that so easily. So, that's all for Chapter 2. So much like Chapter 2, Chapter 3 opens up with Adele once again waking up in his bunk. Only this time, instead of waking up from terrors and nightmares, he wakes up feeling like he's just finished running a marathon. He's just completely exhausted. He has a headache. His body is essentially telling him that he went through some enormous physical exertion. And Captain Boyd has survived the attack as well, and he's sitting there, and initially he's under the impression that whatever Adele did to these Hoyt bandits on the river, he did on purpose, that this was something he knew he was able to do, which Adele quickly dispels. Captain Boyd had initially suspected that Adele was what's called a mage, essentially a magic wielder, which exists in this universe, but Adele had no idea of that. And from the discussions that he had had with mages in the past, he doesn't feel that he has the same power as they do. He feels this is something different. So neither of them really know what it is that's going on. So what Boyd decides to do is when they get to Karlskog, he has an old friend who has essentially traveled around the Empire a lot and has seen a lot of various oddities. So he wants to go and meet with this friend and see if he has any idea what's going on. So they arrive in Karlskog safely, and Boyd and Adele depart the ship, and they head into a sort of a seedy area of town, kind of the place you wouldn't want to be. And they go into this tavern that Boyd's friend owns. Now, Boyd's friend turns out to be an elf. So this is the first time in this series of books that we're seeing a member of another race. There are several other races in this world. However, in this province in Thornata in the far north, they're actually fairly rare to see, and Adele had actually never seen an elf before. And Keeler immediately strikes him as a bit of an odd fellow, someone that maybe Boyd wouldn't normally associate with. He seems he has sort of this swashbuckling type of personality, and he owns a tavern, which is a bit not the type of person, like I said, that Adele would have expected Boyd to be associated with. So they get to talking with Keeler, who's a very old elf, probably in his 80s. And what Keeler says is that he has heard of things like this before, and that what Adele should do is seek out a group of people called the Children of the Rawl. So here we have the Rawl name appearing for the first time, which going forward you'll understand this is the power that Adele owns. Now, Keeler does not know exactly where these Children of the Rawl can be found, but he is quite close with an associate of theirs, whom he believes can be found in the Twin City on the other side of this inland sea called Karlskog. Remember, I get these mixed up because I'm an idiot. And so he directs them to this person, this contact, and wishes them well. But as they're about to leave, the Hoyt arrive in the tavern. And they storm their way back into Keeler's office, and they say, "You need to hand over the boy now, or we're going to kill you." Now, obviously, Captain Boyd is not going to hand over Adele, but Keeler doesn't seem particularly concerned about any of this. And when the Hoyt begin to advance, he essentially pulls a sword from under his desk and dispatches all of these Hoyt fighters single-handedly right before their eyes. This incredible display of fighting ability that just amazes Adele. And he sends them on their way safely. So as Boyd and Adele are making their way back to the shipping barge, he asks a few questions about Keeler, and Boyd reveals, well, Keeler wasn't exactly a friend from the Navy. Keeler was actually a pirate who actually used to ambush ships like mine down in the southern seas. And what had happened was Boyd had been ambushed by a rival pirate of Keeler's. And when Keeler arrived, he killed the other pirates and let Boyd go, because apparently in his heart he's not really a vindictive person, although he is certainly a greedy one. And they sort of formed this odd friendship over the years since. So that's a bit of a shift for Adele's thinking and the way he thinks about his captain. Boyd is this Navy man, he's this really buttoned up kind of guy, and he's associating with this flamboyant, ancient elven pirate. So it gives the younger man sort of a different perspective on things. They're obviously quite eager to get out of Karlskog now that the Hoyt have clearly determined that they are there. So they don't bother to pick up another shipment or anything. They just immediately depart and head south across the inland sea towards Karlskog. And this is where this chapter essentially breaks off. We are heading out in search of this contact for the Children of the Rawl. And the hope is that these Children of the Rawl we'll be able to reveal more about Adele's power and where he needs to go from here. So now we come to Chapter 4, and Chapter 4 is one of my favorite chapters in the book because it's a part of the book where the world is really starting to expand. And as a writer, that's a lot of fun. So Captain Boyd and Adele have arrived in the city of Kalstag, and they're here to search for Keeler's contact, a man named Ola. And Ola ends up being a major character in these books going forward. Now, when they arrive in Kalstag, they notice one thing that's a little bit unusual is that this man is staying in a rather nice part of town. He's staying in a nice inn, which didn't really fit their expectations considering who was sending them to see him. Remember, obviously, Keeler owns sort of a rundown old tavern in a seedy part of town. They were expecting sort of a similar type of character. That's not what they get. And they definitely weren't expecting, when the inn door opened, for this contact of theirs to be an ogre. And here we are again. It's a fantasy book. We've got another fantastical race of creatures. And the ogres are some of my favorites to write about because they're so misunderstood by the other races. And even a character like Adele, who's a good person, he's a genuine, understanding person. As soon as he sees Ola, he sees a certain amount of apprehension because everything that he's heard about ogres, who he's never seen one before, not in this part of the world, they tend to live in warmer climates, is that they are bloodthirsty savages. They enjoy killing people for fun. They're essentially like barely more sentient than your average wild animal. Immediately, Ola sort of throws these beliefs on their head. He speaks in a very eloquent manner. He seems to be educated. He seems to be very knowledgeable about the world. And Ola immediately says that he can take Adele to the children of the Rawl. Now, one thing that Ola does not have are great social skills, and that becomes apparent right out of the gate. So I wanted to create this sort of duality where, yeah, Adele doesn't really understand Ola, but that's a knife that cuts both ways. Ola lacks a certain amount of understanding about Adele. So there's a bit of an argument about whether or not Adele will just leave with Ola to go to the children of the Rawl, and Captain Boyd is somewhat reluctant to see his young deckhand go off with this ogre. However, this has to be Adele's decision to make. And what ultimately causes him to make the decision to go with Ola to seek out the children of the Rawl is he realizes he was in Kalskag and the Hoyt found him. So obviously the Hoyt are angry with him. The Hoyt know what he did to their men on the river, and the Hoyt are going to be seeking retribution. And he does not want to put Captain Boyd or his crew in a position where they are going to be the ones who pay the price for something that he did. So ultimately he decides to take the path of following Ola to the children of the Rawl so that he can learn how to use this power that he's discovered. Ola himself does not possess this power, but he works for the children of the Rawl, and we get into that a little bit more later in the book, but we're not going to discuss that here. So with his mind made up, Adele decides, okay, I'm going to leave my shipping barge, I'm going to leave the only life I've known for the past few years, and I'm going to go with this ogre who I've just met to this place in the mountains called the Temple of the Rawl, and I'm going to learn how to unlock this mysterious power that has shown itself to me. And while he does this out of a certain sense of curiosity for sure, his main reasoning is rather selfless. He wants to protect the lives of his captain and his fellow crewmates by essentially getting away from them. So he and Captain Boyd head back to the barge so that Adele can collect his things, and when they arrive, the captain gives him his sword, a sword that the captain himself had kept from his time in the Navy, and he wanted Adele to have it. And they have sort of a separation moment, almost like a father and son, so to speak, although that's not quite the relationship. And Adele is quite touched and he's saddened to be leaving his family, but at the same time excited about what the future holds. Captain Boyd and his crew announced they're going to leave the province of Thornata for the time being because of what's happened with the Hoyt. They don't want to be targeted continually because of either their association with Adele or just for further robberies. And this fills Adele with a certain amount of regret because it's always been his goal to go and travel to other places within the Empire, but that's not his path right now. And so the chapter ends with Ola arriving at the barge to collect Adele and the pair of them setting off on this new voyage on foot. They're heading off into the mountains to seek out the children of the Rawl. And this is, in my view, where the true adventure of the story really begins. Adele is out of his comfort zone now. He's not with anyone he's ever known. He's with this stranger who's not just a stranger, he's also an ogre who Adele had no idea anything about what they were like or what their personalities or temperaments were. So those are lessons he's going to have to learn. So when chapter 5 starts, we have a little bit of a time jump of about 5 days in between Ola and Adele leaving the barge and where they are now. And they've been making their way across the Thornatan countryside, around the shore of the inland sea, and Adele has learned a little bit about his new companion. The main thing that he has learned is that his new companion is not very talkative. And a lot of their interactions in this chapter are fairly awkward. Adele really doesn't know how to talk to an ogre, and you get the sense that Ola doesn't know how to talk to Adele. When Adele does ask questions, Ola tends to give him very brief responses, almost like he's trying to say the absolute minimum that he can get away with. And we're not really sure why that is. What is it that Ola is being so secretive about? Well, we're not really sure. Is he intentionally trying to conceal things, or is this just his personality? And this is something that sort of ends up explored as the book goes on. But they've been traveling for close to a week when they encounter a group of Hoyt bandits. And they are badly outnumbered. They're outnumbered 5 or 6 to 2, I believe is what I wrote. And so they're in a bad position. They're in the middle of this open field, and Ola immediately tells Adele, listen, whatever you do, don't try to use your power right here. There's just too many ways that can go wrong. Just leave this to me. You don't use your power. You don't know what you're doing, and you could hurt yourself. So Adele sort of stands back, and he draws the sword that Captain Boyd gave him, and he realizes, I have no idea how to use this thing. I've never been in a fight like this before. What am I going to do? Well, it turns out he doesn't have to do much of anything at all, because these Hoyt immediately start insulting Ola and essentially acting horribly. They're horrible people saying horrible things to Ola because of what he is. They're insulting the fact that he's an ogre. They're making jokes about how they want to skin him and make him into a pair of boots and things like that. All manner of vile things. Well, the joke is kind of on them because he immediately just slaughters all of them single-handedly. And it's a rather brutal fight scene. And I wanted it to be that way. I wanted it to be a little graphic, just to sort of show what Ola is capable of physically. This is someone that's just miles ahead of anyone that Adele has ever seen. And he just butchers these Hoyt bandits in a matter of seconds. They never stood a chance against him. And so Adele is standing there just awestruck by what he's seen, and he realizes that if Ola had not been there, he would have essentially been helpless. All he would have been able to do is try to use his power and hope for the best, but he knows that he can't rely on that. So he asks Ola to teach him how to fight with a sword. And Ola immediately resists this idea, saying, well, I'll do the fighting if we have to fight, but Adele manages to sort of convince him by saying, well, isn't it your job to protect me? well, what if something happens to you and I'm out here on my own? Wouldn't it be your fault then if something were to happen to me? Which is quite a clever argument for such a young man who's able to figure out the exact right button to push with this person that he doesn't really have a full understanding yet. And so Ola does agree that he will teach him how to fight, and Adele is immediately excited once again at the prospect. He's tired of feeling helpless. He's tired of feeling like he is dependent on Ola or Captain Boyd or other people to protect him. He wants to take his fate into his own hands. That's what he sees as the reasoning he's come on this journey to begin with. And he feels like this is just another step of doing that. And he's also hopeful that perhaps in these training sessions with Ola, he might be able to gain a better understanding of what this ogre is actually like. And does he? Well, for that we will have to move on to the next chapter. So moving on to chapter 6. When chapter 6 kicks off, Ola and Adele are right in the middle of one of their training sessions. I actually opened the chapter as if Adele was actually in a fight and let that go on for about a paragraph before revealing that it's just Ola and they're just training. So they've been at this for a few days now, and Adele has found that Ola is steadily beginning to open up a little bit more. He seems to enjoy to talk about their training. He likes talking about the progress that Adele is making, and so they've had a few more open conversations. But Ola is still reluctant to talk about anything too personal. He doesn't seem to want to share many intimate details about himself. So they're going through this training session, and Adele is steadily improving, although, to be clear, Ola is very easily besting him. It's pretty clear to the reader and to Adele himself that if they were in a real fight, there would be absolutely nothing he could do to stop Ola from killing him if he wanted to. And Adele's getting a little bit down in the dumps about this because he feels like he should be improving more quickly. Now, they've only been at this for a few days, but when you're a 16-year-old kid, you expect everything to happen much more quickly. You think you're going to master something, and it's not going to be that difficult. So I tried to make that a bit of an accurate depiction of what a person of his age would be feeling in a moment like that. And Ola is more reassuring to him. And so Adele poses the question of where Ola learned how to fight, because he's still amazed by what he saw this one person do against so many foes. And Ola reveals that prior to meeting Adele, and he doesn't give an exact time period, but this was several years in the past, that he was a slave. And that his purpose as a slave was to fight other ogres while people gambled, essentially, on the results of those fights. And he was a slave in these, what they're called the fight pits, in his home province of Greitar. We don't talk much about that in this series, although I'm currently writing a series of books that's much more ogre focused, and it's been interesting to delve into their culture a bit more. But Adele immediately is confused when he hears this explanation, because slavery is not something that is accepted in this world, in this empire. And so he doesn't understand how that could be. So Ola takes the time to explain to him that in the eyes of the empire, ogres are not human beings. They're essentially considered animals. They're not equal, and so they aren't protected by laws banning slavery. And Adele is so disgusted by this because even though he hasn't gotten to know Ola extremely well, he can clearly see that this is a human being just like him, with thoughts and feelings and emotions and intelligence, and that nobody should be treated that way. And this is sort of the first, I don't want to say the first moment where they truly become friends, but the first time that they really bond in a meaningful way, I would say. This is a relationship between two characters that plays such a crucial role in this book, in this series overall. And I really wanted it to feel, I wanted them to understand each other very well. And in order for that to happen, I had to reveal this bit about Ola's past fairly early on in his story arc. And so going forward, Adele, he still gets frustrated at times from Ola not being able to communicate effectively with him. But he carries with him that sense of understanding as to why those difficulties exist. Why is it that Ola has a hard time talking to people? You have to understand that Adele probably looks a lot like the people that had Ola in a cage and forced him to fight other ogres. And those are the type of people that Ola knows. So he probably has just of a hard time understanding Adele as Adele has of understanding him. So Ola reveals that the reason he serves the children of the Rawl is because in the past they were the ones who ultimately freed him from slavery using the power of the Rawl. And it's a story he doesn't go into great detail about, and it's something I've thought about actually writing in maybe a short story at some point. I don't know if I'll do that or not. But it's a story I think I'll end up telling at some point, either way. So he goes sort of vague on the details, but they rescued him from slavery, and that is why he serves them. And the exact details of what he does, he still keeps a little vague, but what he alludes to is that he looks for people like Adele that possess the power of the Rawl and that need guidance. And so this training session ends, and they're both, I think, but especially Adele, because the story takes place from his point of view, so we don't necessarily know exactly what Ola is thinking. But he feels a lot more comfortable with his companion now because of understanding a bit about what Ola has been through. And there's a certain amount of comfort to that, as sad as that sounds, based on what Adele has been through in the past few days and weeks. He feels like he's being, hunted by the Hoyt and persecuted and victimized. And he knows now that his companion can relate to these feelings. And having this real conversation for the first time is really the start of a friendship that, like I said, really plays such a critical role in this book and in this series as a whole. So it was sort of a heavier chapter for me to write. I don't really like writing about those sorts of topics, but I also try to base my writing on reality. I think in fantasy, there's a lot of the real world in fantasy. It finds its way in there whether we like it or not, because we write based on our own experiences, our own lives, our own knowledge. And for me to say that Ola was just an ogre and there was nothing unique about that experience for him, to me would have been a disservice. I had to craft a story that was real, that felt human, and that was the story that ultimately I decided to go with. So even though those particular bits of dialogue and those scenes aren't easy for me to write, I hope that they make the work feel more authentic. I hope that they transfer certain emotions to the reader, and those might vary a little bit per reader, and that's fine. I think that what's great about reading books is that each of us reacts to the story in our own unique way based on who we are and the experiences that we've had. And that's a beautiful thing. So, Chapter 6 was really focused on building that relationship a little bit, removing a little bit of that awkwardness between them, and allowing their friendship to really start to form. So Chapter 7 is the first of a series of chapters where my goal was really to expand the world and really sort of move the story into the next phase. The first 6 were in many ways an introduction to Adele, letting him learn a little bit about the world, getting to know him through the eyes of a reader. So in Chapter 7, we meet for the first time the main antagonist of this series of books. He's the leader of the Hoyt, and his name is Idanox. Now, Idanox is maybe not what most people would expect when thinking about a leader of a group of bandits. He's not some hardened criminal or anything like that. He's not even particularly a skilled fighter in any way. He is actually extremely wealthy. Well, why would an extremely wealthy person want to lead a group of bandits that are robbing shipping barges and trading caravans when he already has all the money he could ever need? Well, he has money, but what he doesn't have is what he truly craves, and that's power. He understands that money only goes so far, and that in order to have true power, you have to have a following. So, like I said, he's not a skilled warrior or anything like that, but what he does have is a deep understanding of the way that people think and the way their minds work. And he's good at recognizing people that he can manipulate. He's very intelligent, and if he were a better person, he would probably be able to do a lot of good in the world, but that's not his goal. His goal, well, I wouldn't even say that. His goal is actually, in many ways, to do good in the world, but he's misguided about how to do it. He believes that ultimately, for good to happen in the world, he has to be in charge. And so what he is attempting to do with the Hoyt is weaken the government of Thornata and ultimately take control as the leader of the province, which is a duke in this case. Each province has a duke who is answerable only to the emperor of the empire. So in chapter 7, there's a story about a subordinate in the Hoyt who brings him the news of the attack on Ola and Adele from several chapters back, explains that they failed to capture Adele, and Idonax makes a example of this messenger by murdering him in front of a camp of bandits. This is more so just done to show his ruthlessness, to show the type of depths he is willing to sink to when he feels he has been failed. The point of the chapter was more so to give you an introduction to the character, how his personality works, what his motivations are. So they're in this camp, and he has several hundred Hoyt bandits with him, which alone is shocking because, keep in mind, from everything we've heard from Adele's point of view, the Hoyt are a relatively small group of scum, just riffraff that are out targeting the weak. But Idonax has managed to assemble this rather sizable force, and there are more arriving every day. And he is working on this intricate plan to attack one of the province's major cities, Colig. And this is part of a series of strikes he is planning that will ultimately allow him to seize control of the province for himself. So Idonax is a little bit familiar with the power of the Rawl himself. He doesn't have it, but he has heard rumors of its use. Keep in mind, he's a wealthy man. He has access to knowledge and resources that most people in this type of place wouldn't have. So he suspects, based on the direction that they were traveling, that they're heading for the Temple of the Rawl. He doesn't know exactly where this temple is because nobody knows exactly where this temple is, except for the children and those that work for them. But he believes he knows the general location within the Bonner Mountains it can be found, so he deploys a rather significant group of fighters to go either capture or kill Adele. So why does he do this? It's just a young boy who admittedly did anger him with what he did to his man on the river, but why can't he let that go? Well, he has these plans for essentially taking over the province, and he immediately recognizes that someone like Adele with unnatural power could potentially stand in his way. So he wants to remove him as a threat and potentially even turn him as an ally. And Idonax feels he can do this because it's essentially how he's built the Hoyt from scratch into a rather sizable force ready to attack a major city. See, Idonax, what he does, in many ways he's a paradox. He's this extremely wealthy man, and these people who are fighting under him are the exact opposite. Many of them are former farmers or stable boys, professions like this that he has slowly built this following of over the course of the past several years by telling them, listen, the people who run this province don't care about you. They only care about people like me who are extremely wealthy. Well, I care about you, and if I end up in power, I will make your life better. So he brings these people together, and then what do? They go out and they attack similar people, traders and innocent people who are not so different from the people who Idanox has brought over to his side in the first place. And he's using this to continue to manipulate them. He's saying, listen, look at what we're doing to these poor common people. What is the Thornatan army or their government or their duke doing to stop us? They're not doing anything. They don't care about people like them, and they don't care about people like you. So he's continuing to build this devout loyalty from his followers by having them essentially attack people similar to themselves. It's twisted, but if you think about it, he's a master manipulator, and he's figured out exactly how to build this loyalty in these people, and he has them at a point where they will do virtually anything that he asks of them because they believe if they continue to do this, they will get him into power. And once he's in power, they will be the ones in control. They don't have to look up from poverty anymore. He's going to improve their lives. He's going to give them lives worth living. Now, is that his true goal? No, he's just using these people to get himself where he needs to be. And during his interior monologue during this chapter, he even says it. If these people couldn't build themselves into prosperity, what do they think I'm going to do for them? But it doesn't matter to him that he's lying to these people, that he's misleading them, that he's using them to inflict serious harm, as long as it helps him meet his own ends. So moving on to chapter 8, we're back with Adele and Ola. And the journey is almost at an end. They've finally gotten close to reaching the Temple of the Rawl. They're slogging up these foothills on a really hot day, but Ola keeps telling him, we're going to get there today, we're going to get there today. And Adele is ready to see the end of this journey. He's tired, he's exhausted, and he is ready to learn more about this power that he has that he doesn't understand. So everything goes smoothly, they get there, and they live happily ever after. Okay, that part's not true. Instead, Adele is trying his best to keep his mind occupied elsewhere, away from the oppressive heat. He's thinking a lot about the journey, a lot about his experience with Ola and what he's learned about him, and he's trying to speculate on what is waiting for him going forward when he reaches the Temple of the Rawl. But of course, the journey can't end so smoothly, and you'll recall in the previous chapter, Idanox had sent a rather large force of men after them. So keep that in mind as they approach the temple. They are greeted by one of the guardians of the temple. Now, the guardians of the temple are, to put it simply, giants, which Adele cannot believe. He had heard stories about giants growing up, and essentially they were like fairy tales for him. It was a story, something his mother might have told him when he was a small child. So he sees this giant named Klawek, who leads the giants who protect the Temple of the Rawl, and they have a brief conversation before they're interrupted by the aforementioned Hoyt forces that Idanox has sent after him. Once again, the Hoyt display essentially the type of people they are. Once again, they're insulting Ola, they're insulting Klawek, which is a bit mind-boggling considering Klawek is about 30 feet tall and massive and carrying a giant club. But they must feel security in their numbers because there are roughly 30 of them, and that ends up to not make much of a difference at all, as they will discover the hard way. They attack. Ola immediately shields Adel, gets him to safety, puts him up against a tree and sort of shields him with his own body, and Clawek goes to work on the Hoyt, dispatching them extremely brutally. Several of them flee, but he does not seem too concerned. He is very confident that himself and his fellow giants will hunt them down and make sure that they cannot take word back to their leaders about what happened. So imagine this from Adel's point of view. You're here, you're about to reach this temple of the Rawl and begin this new chapter of your life. You get attacked by this massive group of men, and you see this giant just absolutely destroy them. So he's in a bit of a state of shock, but he and Ola do continue their way to the temple. They're climbing up this steep stone staircase into the mountains. The Temple of Rawl is meant to be extremely inaccessible, an extremely formidable fortress. Obviously, nobody knows its exact location. That does not need to know its exact location. Then you discover they have giants defending it, and there are additional defenses as well, which are explained later in the book and later in the series. So they finally get up the stairs, and they come to this massive wall. And in this massive stone wall is a massive stone door, which should not be possible to open because of how heavy it looks, but it opens quite easily from the inside. And waiting for them is an ancient old man calling himself Elim, and he is one of the children of the Rawl. And he welcomes Adel to the temple and assures him that he is safe and that his journey has truly just begun. And that is how Chapter 8 concludes, sort of a promise of what is to come. Now, Chapter 9 is very much a lore-building chapter. So we've met Elim, and once we get into the temple, we see the other members of the Children of the Rawl, and Adel discovers that all of them, just like Elim, are very, very old men. Irony of this is not lost on him, and what I was going for creatively here is obviously a bit of a paradox. These people call themselves the Children of the Rawl, and they're all ancient old men. Who these people are is they are Rawl Wielders like Adel who have reached the ends of their lives, and since they're no longer able to wield their power effectively anymore due to their age and their frailty, they go to this temple to do things such as keep records of Rawl Wielders, research the history of the power, and seek out people like Adel who they can train in the use of the power. So Adel's first lesson after arriving at the temple isn't so much a lesson on how to use his power, but rather a history lesson. And he learns that he's obviously not the only Rawl Wielder in the world, but rather there is also an entire race of Rawl Wielders out there called the Thrall. Now, in this universe, the Thrall are what some people would probably refer to in modern culture as the big bad guy. They are the Thanos, they are the White Walkers, and etc. They are the ultimate evil. And they use the Thrall for nefarious purposes, and these purposes aren't revealed here in this book, and their full purposes won't be revealed for quite some time, but I did need to establish their existence here right from the beginning. And part of the function of the Children of the Rawl are to be prepared in case this race of villainous Rawl Wielders decides to attack the Empire or try to engage in other nefarious activities. Very little is known about them, however. What is known is that the land that they call home, to the west of Thornata, is a barren, lifeless desert. And the children have their own theories as to why that is, though they do not delve too deeply into this with Adel. So really the full purpose, if I really had to break down Chapter 9, would be the first opportunity for Adele to learn a little bit about his power, but most importantly, a little bit about this large scale conflict that he sort of found himself thrust into the middle of without really realizing it. Now, because he has this power, he's going to have a certain responsibility if something should happen, rather in the near or distant future, some sort of conflict with this race of powerful Rawl Wielders. He's going to have that obligation to take part in that. So, that's really all I can dive into in that without giving away too much about future books. Obviously, it's not a storyline that I created just to leave out there sitting, but it is more of a slow burning storyline. So, it's something that I really wanted to do with this series was create a large scale conflict that takes place over a span of years or decades, while at the same time creating other conflicts that happen more immediately. And that's the story of Adele and his conflict with Idanox and the Hoyt. And the story of the Thrall is a more overarching tale that will take part over the course of the entire saga and eventually reach its climax at the end. So I'm about to go over chapter 10, but before I do, I just have a quick question, and if you feel like answering in the comments down below, that would be wonderful. So I'm sitting here recording this on the 4th of July, and it's still fairly early. The sun is shining outside, and I can't help but notice that several people in my neighborhood who have evidently spent a rather large amount of money on aerial fireworks are currently lighting them off when you can't possibly see them in the sky. Does anybody have an explanation for this? Feel free to leave it down there. Okay. Now moving on to chapter 10, then I think I'm going to take a recording break and finish this up tomorrow because my voice is getting tired. For chapter 10, we are going back to our antagonist, Idanox, and he is in the midst of carrying out his planned assault on the city of Coleg. Now he's done this by having several of his Hoyt men infiltrate their city watch. City gates are kept closed at night, and there is also a river which separates the gates of the city from the outside world. So to get into the city, you have to cross over a bridge and pass through some gates. He has figured out how to circumvent this problem by having several of his people infiltrate the city watch and open the gates for them in the middle of the night so that several hundred of his men can swarm into the city and overpower the city watch before they know what's happening. This works quite well for him, and he seizes control of the city. He murders the city's governor and other ranking officials and installs himself as the governor of Coleg. However, this is not his objective. His objective, of course, is to rule the whole province, and he's not able to do that by merely controlling one city. However, this assault is a key part of his plan, and I was thinking to myself, there has to be... Obviously, his bandits are going to be outnumbered by the Thornatan army. There's no way that they can just march on the capital city of Oriana and just take control. It would never happen. They would be slaughtered. No matter how charismatic he is, no matter how many people he manages to bring over to his side, it's just not going to happen. So what would a man like this do in order to turn the odds in their favor? And I think a man like Idanox would execute a plan like this. Target one of your smaller, weaker cities, seize control of it. This is going to draw the Thornatan army to attack you. This is exactly what you want them to do if you have the right staging ground, which in this case is the city of Coleg. You see, Kolig is located, as I described it before, you have to cross a bridge over a river to enter the city. It's situated on the banks of a river. And upstream from the city is located a large dam which is used for irrigation. This is a portion of the province which produces a large number of crops that feed their people. So what Idonox figures out is that once he seizes control of the city, if he has his men destroy the bridge entering the city, the army, who is inevitably going to come after them, will only have one way to enter the city, and that's by boat crossing the river. Now, if the army is on boats crossing the river, what do you think would happen if suddenly the floodgates of the dam a few miles upstream were to suddenly open all the way? That would spell disaster for the army, right? So Idonox executed this plan with the intention of the army coming after him so that he could wipe out a large number of them on the river and give himself more favorable odds in the coming weeks and months as he seeks to take over the whole province. Now, he himself doesn't even stay in Kolig. He spends one night there and then he vanishes because he doesn't want to be there when the army does arrive, just in case they do manage to get into the city. So he sets his men up, ruling the city, and then he turns tail and gets out of there before all of the real mayhem happens. Now, obviously, people like the Hoyt are not going to be overly concerned with treating the people of this city very well, and there are going to be acts of brutality against them. There are going to be people killed or beaten and tortured, all in the name of keeping order, which Idonox gladly authorizes. But by the end of the chapter, he has struck his first big blow against the Thornatans. Now, how was he able to do this so effectively? Well, earlier we were talking about how he convinced people to his cause. You should join me because your government doesn't care about you. They don't care about the little guy, basically. Well, this plan works in a sense because he's right. In many ways, he isn't lying. He's telling the truth. He's just telling the truth as a means of achieving a horrible end. He's doing it as a means of gathering more power for himself and screw everybody else. But he is telling the truth. The Thornatan government doesn't particularly care about trading caravans being robbed or shipping barges or people being murdered by bandits in the countryside because they don't care, so to speak, about the little guy. Idonox recognized it and realized it was his path to power. So when chapter 11 kicks off, we're back with Adele, and he's still in the Temple of the Rawl, and he is going through some practical training of learning how to use that power, and he is struggling. He's finding that it does not come as easily as it did on the river when he's actually intentionally trying to use it rather than instinctually trying to use it. And Elim is being very encouraging, but not particularly helpful because he understands that this is something that Adele needs to discover on his own. And he gets so frustrated he needs to stop the training, and he leaves the temple, he goes outside, and he resumes his sword training with Ola. And he's been continuing this during his time at the temple because he feels it's important, and Ola feels it's important, and the children feel it's important that he knows how to defend himself not only with his power, but also physically as well. And he finds this really helps clear his head. And Ola has some great advice for him, and I'm not going to get too much into the overall specifics here. You'll read the story if you want to read the story, because I don't really want to dive into a full-blown technical breakdown of how the power of the Rawl works. But he gets back to it the next morning, goes back to his training with Elim. He's got this renewed sense of energy, he's determined, he's going to do it, and initially he's still failing. But this is finally the day where he does pull it off. He does manage to use the power intentionally. And then his training can really begin in earnest. And so, rather than diving into this too deep, even in the book, I wanted to sort of just give a little bit of a breakdown of the various ways in which he's able to use the power. But I'm not a huge fan of long, drawn out training montages or things like that, so I didn't put any of those in my book. Instead, we get just a little bit of a glimpse as to what the power is capable of doing, and mainly I wanted to just put a little bit of a baseline in there and then let the readers discover a little bit for themselves as the story progresses about what he is capable of. But I do allude to the fact that he's at this training for several weeks before somebody new arrives at the temple. Hey, we have a female character in the book, and her name is Alcy. And she came in a little later in the story than I had originally intended. In my original outline, she came in a little bit earlier, but I decided to postpone her entry to the story. Originally, she was going to join forces with Adele and Ola on their journey to the temple. But I decided against that because I really wanted the time and the space to really focus on that friendship between the pair of them first. And so I pushed Alcy's arrival in the story back here to chapter 11 in the Temple of the Rawl. And so this is the first time she's meeting Adele, and on the surface she does not seem overly impressed with him, and she does not pay him much mind. However, she does have bad news. It turns out she was in Colig when the Hoyt took over, and she managed to flee the city and return to the children to bring them news of this. She understands the Hoyt's plan because this is her job for the children. She listens and she gathers information. So she overhears the Hoyt talking about their plan to ambush the army on the river by opening the dam, and she wants to stop this from happening. So she wants Ola to go with her to Colig and see what they can do. And he quickly agrees, and Adele quickly jumps in that he wants to come as well. Alcy is dead set against this idea, but Elam is in support of it and overrules her. And so it's decided that the three of them will set out quickly and get to Colig and try to prevent the ambush of the Thornatan army from happening. And we are off again on yet another adventure. I wanted the time at the temple to go fairly quickly, and I didn't want it to be tedious, which is one reason why in the middle of it I included the chapter of the fall of Colig, because, you know, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, and I think about the time spent in Rivendell, and I love everything about the Lord of the Rings, and I love those chapters, but I also acknowledge that they can drag a bit. And the chapters at the home of Tom Bombadil can drag a bit, and I was trying to avoid a situation like that. So I wanted to get there and get the important stuff out of the way and get out. I knew it was going to be a bit of a longer sequence in the story, so I broke it up a bit by throwing chapter 10 into the middle of that. So chapter 11 closes with this newly formed trio about to depart the temple, and hopefully they can get to Colig in time. So chapter 12, we're kicking off the start of this new adventure. This newly minted trio is setting out from the Temple of the Rawl, and they're going to try to do what they can to free the city of Colig from the control of the Hoyt and warn the Thornatan army about this trap that Idanox has laid for them. So they depart the temple, and Alcy is in the lead, and Adele quickly realizes that, very much like Ola, she's going to go, and she's not going to slow down. She's going to go at her pace, and he's just going to have to adjust to that. And she has very little to say to him that morning. However, as they get further away from the Temple of the Rawl, and they're moving at this breakneck pace because they're trying to get there as quickly as possible, and they know they have several days' journey ahead of them, Ola brings them to a stop, and he realizes that they're being surrounded. So surprise, surprise, the Hoyt have found them again. They've likely just been sitting in wait for Adele to show himself. And this time they don't bother to stop and talk. They're not interested in taking Adele captive, they just start opening fire with bows from long range. So by doing this, they're essentially stating their intent: we're just going to kill you, we're not interested in bringing you to our side anymore. And they're also neutralizing the threat that obviously Ola provides, since obviously their prior encounters with him have not gone in their favor. So this time it's up to Adele to be the hero. He's the one who has to step up and save them, because they're surrounded on all sides by attackers shooting at them from long range. They never stand a chance. And the only equalizer in this is his power, the power of the Rawl. And he manages to do this and conjure it up masterfully by creating this wind curtain around them, so that any arrows that do come towards them just careen harmlessly away. And also manages to take advantage of this. In the opposite effect, she pulls out her own bow and is firing out through the curtain, and his wind barrier is actually propelling her arrows at their attackers with even greater speed, giving them even less of a chance to avoid them. And eventually the Hoyt decide, we're not going to be able to kill them this way, and we're losing our fighters to their arrows, so they run into attack on foot, and Adele manages to buy them even more time by extending his attack and blasting them all off their feet. And before you know it, the Hoyt are defeated. Adele even manages to hold his own against one of them in a brief sword fight, and he saves Ola at one point by using his power to deflect an axe that gets thrown at Ola. And so by the end of this encounter, he's done a few things. One, he's proven himself in the eyes of Alcy that he belongs on this mission. She gains a great deal of respect for him. She realizes that they would all be dead if he hadn't been there, which on the one hand is true, but on the other, in his head, he's thinking to himself, well, if I wasn't here, they probably wouldn't have attacked you in the first place. But he's also gained quite a bit of confidence in himself, because he knows, just as well as they do, that he was the big turning point in that fight, was him using his power. And he did so effectively, and his time in the temple has built his endurance, so he didn't just black out immediately like he did after using it on the river. So they hurry on their way after the attack, because they realize they could fall under attack again. There could be more Hoyt fighters nearby. And when they do finally come to a stop for the evening, they have this discussion. It's sort of the first time the three of them have a lengthy discussion as a team about what exactly they're going to do when they get to Kolig. And they understand that they're going to have certain difficulties ahead of them. You know, I've talked a little bit about, for example, how the people in this part of their world view ogres. So what they're doing is they're going to warn the army that they're walking into a trap. But they understand if they walk in there, two young people, probably most people wouldn't even consider them adults at this point, and an ogre, they're not going to be taken very seriously. And so they decide, rather than wasting their breath trying to get into an army camp and get in front of a general and try to persuade them that they're going about their attack the wrong way, they decide that they're going to instead go straight to the dam where the Hoyt are plotting their attack and take control of it back from the Hoyt, so that the army can cross the river without issues and take control of the city back. The army never even has to know they were involved. And this is a bit of a turning point for Adele, because, as you can imagine, the Hoyt aren't going to leave this dam lightly guarded. So they understand that in order to do this, he's likely going to need to use his power once again in an effective way to overcome the odds against them. And he doesn't really hesitate, whereas before he probably would have been indecisive about this type of thing. But this encounter that they've just had with the Hoyt has given him the confidence to realize that he can make a difference in that type of situation. So he agrees right away. Let's do it. We're going to take the dam back from the Hoyt. Their trap's not going to work. The army's going to sail right into the city, and that's going to be the end of the Hoyt. And so we leave chapter 12 on a bit of a high note. They have a plan, they're ready to go, they're chomping at the bit to get at the Hoyt. So let's hope all goes according to plan, right? So the next handful of chapters are all pretty short because they all encapsulate essentially one part of the story from various points of view. So chapter 13 picks up several days after chapter 12, where our trio is finally drawing close to the city of Colig, finally getting ready to put their plan into motion to take control of the dam back from the Hoyt. So they're getting really close, and Ola spots tracks on the ground. A rather large number of tracks, like a large number of people have recently passed through the area. And after examining them, he sees these are most likely caused by people carrying heavy weapons and wearing heavy armor. So in other words, soldiers. And so now they realize that they're in quite a bit of trouble. They thought they were going to arrive at Colig before the army, but it seems at this point as though the army might just be ahead of them. So they take off at a breakneck pace trying to get to Colig in time. And they arrive at Colig, and they can finally see the city, and they see right in front of them the army has already arrived. They've already set up a camp across the river from the city, and they're already in the process of launching their boats into the river with hundreds and thousands of soldiers aboard these boats. And they realize that they are too late. If the soldiers are already out in the water, there's nothing to stop the Hoyt from opening the floodgates at any time and wiping out hundreds or thousands of these soldiers who will be absolutely helpless. And Adele takes this really hard. He immediately blames himself for not being faster, and he thinks they have failed. But Ola is a bit different. He thinks we can still do this, we just have to adjust the plan. And so he starts taking charge of the group and states, listen, I'm going to get to the dam by myself. If they open the floodgates, I'm going to close the floodgates. But Adele is going to have to get down close to the river, because if they do open the floodgates before I get there, his power is going to be the only thing that can stop the water from killing all of these soldiers. And Adele and Alcee quickly start to argue with him, but he just shuts it down immediately, saying, listen, this is the only way. This might not have a great chance of success, but this is the only way. It's for me to go by myself, Adele to try to stop the river if they open the floodgates, and if he's doing that, he's going to be defenseless. So I'll say you have to stay with him and make sure that he stays safe. And before they can really respond, he takes off. And so, obviously, they're not going to be able to catch this giant ogre running off at full speed, so they realize they don't really have much choice but to go with his plan. So they hurry down to the riverbanks. And pretty much as soon as they arrive, they hear this sound coming from upriver. And they realize it's the gears of the dam and the floodgates opening, and the sound of millions of gallons of water just spilling out of these floodgates. And the chapter closes with Adele taking a deep breath, realizing this is completely up to me to stop the flow of an entire river long enough to give Ola time to close those floodgates. And he's taking a deep breath, he's trying to focus himself, and the chapter ends. We then head right into chapter 14, which is the first time we get to have a chapter from Ola's point of view. And it's another short chapter, but it was one of my favorite chapters because it's just this one character who I really enjoy writing on his own, trying to do the impossible. He's racing towards this dam, trying to get to the controls for the floodgates. He has arrows falling around him. The Hoyt are trying to stop him. He cuts a few of them down, and as he's running, he hears someone shout for him to stop. And he turns, and it's an army patrol, and they were heading towards the dam themselves to secure it. And immediately, they don't trust him at all. Why? Because he's an ogre. They immediately think he's working for the Hoyt. And he's trying to stay, no, they're about to open the floodgates. I'm trying to go stop them. You have to help me. And the army isn't buying any of it. You have to come with us. We're not trusting anything you say. And then more Hoyt fighters come upon them, and Ola takes them out right in front of the soldiers. And the soldiers are left kind of speechless. And Ola just says, listen, I'm going to the dam. I'm going to close these floodgates. You can help me if you want, but do not get in my way. And he takes off. He doesn't wait for them to respond. He just goes. He gets to the dam, the floodgates are opening, and the dam is essentially lined with Hoyt fighters who are there specifically to stop anyone from getting to the controls. As he's about to head out onto the dam to try to fight his way through, he realizes that the soldiers have followed him. They're not trying to stop him, they're trying to help him at this point. They're even saying, okay, we've got to get the floodgates closed. So Ola heads out onto the top of this dam. He has to cross the dam to get to the controls, and he just goes to town on these Hoyt fighters. They're absolutely no match for him. It's a narrow space where they can't engage him with their superior numbers. So he's just hacking his way through them. They're definitely hurting him in response. He's getting cut, he's getting shot, but he just keeps fighting. And he fights his way through to the other side. And he gets to this little building where they have the controls for the dam, and he realizes that he can't fit inside because he's too big. So he's shouting for one of these soldiers to go in, and they do, and they manage to get the floodgates closed. And as he's hearing the floodgates close and the water slowing down, he actually collapses right there on top of the bridge from the extent of his injuries. 14 was a lot of fun for me. It was a great way for me to have a lot of fun with a character that I really enjoy writing and have it make sense in the context of the story. So, I really enjoy writing scenes of Ola being a badass, but I don't like doing it for the sake of having scenes of Ola being a badass, because it just doesn't fit well in the story. It's not that type of story. So when those opportunities present themselves, I really enjoy them. Now, Chapter 15 is essentially the same period of time that was just covered in Chapter 14, only it takes place from Adele's point of view. And it opens with him just trying to hold back this water that's pouring down the river, well, the water's not trying, but the intent of it is to wipe out these boats of soldiers on the river. And this is far beyond anything he's done before, including his first experience with his power against the Hoyt, because he's trying to hold back millions and millions of gallons of water. And so what his power is allowing him to do is halt the flow of the river, but there's all this excess water, and there's nowhere else for it to go, so it's sort of suspending in the air above his head because there's nothing else to do with it. He can't just let it go because there's too much of it. No matter what he tries to do, it's going to destroy all of those boats and kill all of those soldiers. So he's just holding it in place, essentially, at a dead stop. And he's even thinking to himself while he's doing this, I'm not going to be able to hold this very long, because he's remembering all the times at the temple and the time on the river before where he used his power and it just completely depleted him, and this is so far beyond anything he's done before. So he's so ultimately focused on what he's doing that he's completely unaware of anything going on around him, but he can tell when the pressure that's coming towards him starts to fade, and he realizes that Ola must have closed the floodgates. So now he doesn't have to worry so much about more water coming, but he still has this large mass of water that he's stopped, and he doesn't know what to do with it. So if he just releases it, it's going to cause the same problems as the water being released from the dam. It's going to wipe out the soldiers. The force of it's probably going to take out a large portion of the city. He can't just let it go. And he can't just drop it anywhere on the ground either, because this is mostly farmland that depends on that feeds a good portion of the province, plus there's an imperial army camp nearby. He doesn't want to kill any of those soldiers. So he's kind of stuck here with this large mass of water hanging in the air that he has nothing to do with. And to compound matters and make them worse, Alcé is saying in his ear, we have some Hoyt fighters coming our way, and it's more than I'm going to be able to fight by myself. And so these Hoyt fighters are approaching, and he's holding this water, and he's doing this calculation almost in his head. What if I were to drop the water close to the Hoyt fighters, take them out, and would this damage the farmlands? Would this hurt any of the soldiers? And he's doing all of this in his head, and he realizes he's running out of time, and he's just going to have to trust his power to do what he wants it to do. So he lets the water go in the direction of the Hoyt fighters, and it takes them out, and the water doesn't hurt him or Alcé, so his power is instinctually protecting him, and he sees the water flowing off in various directions so that no one specific area is getting flooded too harshly. It's going to be a pretty bad mess no matter what. He's held so much water back that there's no avoiding it. But what his power has instinctually allowed him to do is release it with the minimum amount of damage possible while serving his needs and getting rid of the Hoyt fighters that were coming to attack him. So those 3 chapters were pretty quick. Each one was only a couple pages long, and the main idea there was I wanted to develop these characters' abilities to think on the fly, to adjust when everything goes horribly wrong all of a sudden. Obviously, I didn't want it to be as easy as the 3 of them just storming the dam and oh, the city is saved. I wanted to challenge them a bit, and I wanted to push Adel to his absolute limits, which I did, as he once again blacks out as soon as he finishes his massive expenditure of his power. There was no way he was going to be able to keep himself conscious after that. But it was a good example of what he can do when really pushed. That was an extreme example. It was one that the children would not have expected him to have to face so early in his training, but he stepped up and delivered when it was really necessary. And as far as how that affects him going forward and affects the way people see him, I suppose we'll have to move on to chapter 16. So chapter 16 opens with Adel waking up inside a tent inside of the Imperial encampment. And they've brought him here after finding them on the riverbank. And he's immediately confused. He doesn't know where he is, and he doesn't know everything that's happened. Alcé is by his side, and she quickly assures him that Ola is okay, although quite badly injured. And this is a good relationship building moment between the 2 characters. They get to have a brief conversation in private for really the first time, and Adel gets to explore a little bit, learn a little bit more about her. At this point, it's just friendship still, but he feels a certain attachment to her, largely because, if you think about it, it's the only character he's been around this entire book that's around his age, and he's curious about her. He wants to find out, for example, how she ended up serving the children of the Rawl, but before she can answer all of his questions, they're interrupted by a Thornatan general, General Byrne. And to put it lightly, this guy is a prick, and they don't like him very much at all. As soon as he enters the room, he's demanding answers about how Adel managed to stop the river, and he has no patience for anything other than direct answering of his questions. He is dismissive of them, and he says some insulting things regarding Ola. So just as Adel is about to tell this guy to go stick it, a fire breaks out in the camp, and the Hoyt have sort of taken one last shot at the Thornatan army by lighting fire to several of their tents. And so it sends the camp into chaos. Even though he's tired and exhausted, he uses the power of the Rawl to extinguish the fire for them, which, at least momentarily, satisfies General Byrne, and he agrees to let them see Ola, allows them to move to Ola's tent where he's being treated by the healers, and treats them with a modicum of respect. There's still a certain hostility there, but he does allow them, after they've essentially saved his bacon, he's treating them with a little bit more respect. But this is a good way to illustrate the fact that they were right in their earlier plan in assuming that they would not be taken seriously if they went to the army directly and tried to warn them of the Hoyt plot. It simply would not have happened. A general like this, General Byrne, who's in command of this force, would never have taken them seriously. They were completely right to take actions into their own hands. And I just wanted to show a little bit of how the wider world is going to view someone like Adele. They view someone like Ola. They're not going to take them seriously either because of what they are, in Ola's case being an ogre, or because of their age, in the case of Adele and Alcé. And this was a good opportunity to demonstrate that. So as chapter 17 opens, Adele and Ola and Alcé are preparing to make their return to the Temple of the Rawl. They've done what they intended to do. They've come and averted disaster. They're recovering from their injuries and exhaustion, and it's about time for them to go. But before they can leave, they receive word that the general wants to see them again, and they're immediately filled with dread from their last encounter with this General Byrne character. And none of them are all that excited about the prospect. However, when the general arrives, they find it is not General Byrne, but rather Supreme General Randall MacLeod, who is the top general of the entire Thornatan army, and a bit of a legend in the province, as it turns out. And I'm not going to get into his full backstory here, but he's been in command of the entire army for decades now, and the stories about him are legendary, so you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in Thornata that's not familiar with him or his body of work. And he immediately reveals himself to be quite different from General Byrne. For starters, he treats them with respect and kindness right out of the gate, and thanks them for the role they have played in keeping his army safe. He reveals to them that Idanox has slipped through their fingers. Even though they have retaken control of Colig, he was nowhere to be found. As we already know, he had no intention of staying in the city. So what MacLeod is doing is he's forming a strike force of elite soldiers, and their job is going to be to hunt down Idanox and his forces wherever they can find them and take them out. The Duke has apparently finally had enough of the Hoyt's nonsense after they took the bold step of taking control of an entire city, so he's authorized MacLeod to form this strike force and go after Idanox directly. Now what MacLeod wants is he wants Adele to accompany them upon learning that he is a Rawl Wielder, because he obviously sees the value that someone like this could bring, and he's perfectly happy to have Ola and Alcé along as well. He doesn't pressure them by any means, but he does make it known that they would be making a huge difference, and leaves them to discuss this among themselves. So of course they do, and Adele is having somewhat conflicting thoughts. His original intention had been to return to the Temple of the Rawl and resume his training, but now he's been presented this opportunity to potentially bring the fight to the Hoyt, put an end to them, and stop anything from happening similar to what happened in Colig. And it's an offer he takes seriously. One of the hesitations he has is that he knows if he does do this, his friends Ola and Alcé will insist on coming with him. and he does not want to put their lives in danger. So the three of them are weighing the pros and the cons of going along with MacLeod's request. Now, at his heart, Adele is a character that always wants to do the right thing. He's always thinking about others, and that's really what drives his decision making throughout his story. And what ultimately leads him to the decision to go with MacLeod is the simple fact that he feels, especially after the impact he was able to have on the Battle of Colig, that his presence could potentially help end this conflict sooner. It could potentially ensure that fewer people end up being victims of the Hoyt. He's still carrying with him that first encounter he had with the Hoyt, where they attacked his shipping barge and killed several of his friends. And he wants to spare anyone that he can from having to endure what he's endured at their hands. So despite his reservations that he's still just a kid and maybe there is a limit to how much he can do, and of course his trepidations about involving his friends in this matter, they do decide to join this strike force that MacLeod is forming, and they are going to bring the fight to Idanox. They're going to go after the Hoyt. They're going to take out their leader, cut the head off the snake, if you will, and put an end to this nonsense, once and for all. So it's time to dive into Chapter 18, and that means it's time for a time jump. So Adele and his friends have been working with General MacLeod and his strike force for a few weeks now. They've hit a few Hoyt targets, they've done some damage to the Hoyt, and now they have arrived in the city of Karlstag, and yes, I did say the right one this time, because General MacLeod has received intelligence that Idanox is inside of this city, that he's hiding out in an abandoned warehouse, and he's planning to use the city as a way of fleeing the province altogether. It's one of the southernmost cities, and he's going to try to get on a boat and flee the province before he can be brought to justice. So Adele and the general and all of their friends and soldiers hurried across the province to get there in time to prevent this from happening. And they're waiting in a warehouse of their own. MacLeod doesn't want them sticking out like a sore thumb in the city streets or anything like that that might cause Idanox to flee before they have a chance to apprehend him. So they themselves are hiding out in a warehouse themselves and waiting for nightfall to come so that they can act on this intelligence that they've received. So since they're going to be moving against him at night, the soldiers take all of their armor off. They're just wearing black clothing so that they blend in the night. They split up and they start moving through the city in small groups so as to not attract attention of one large group coming towards this warehouse that Idanox is hiding out in. They converge on the warehouse and breach it. They hurry inside, a little surprised to find that there isn't more security on it. But sure enough, when they get inside, they find a group of Hoyt fighters huddled around a fire. And they've done it. They've found what they were looking for, so it seems. But from the jump, Adele at least can sense that something is off. These Hoyt fighters haven't sent any sort of sentries outside, and they don't seem overly concerned by all of these soldiers now standing in this warehouse. So MacLeod demands to see Idanox, demands that he hands himself over, and the Hoyt begin laughing, and the door slams shut behind the soldiers and Adele and Ola and Alce, and they realize they've fallen into a trap. So as soon as the door slams shut, these panels on the outside wall start moving as well, and reveal that the Hoyt have staged archers inside of the warehouse walls, who then immediately begin opening fire on the soldiers. And complete pandemonium ensues. The soldiers attack because they don't really have any other options. Their only way out is to eliminate the Hoyt. But with the archers raining fire on them from inside the walls, it's going to be a very difficult task to do. Adele immediately tries to help as he did in an early chapter with his windshield that he formed, but he finds that inside the warehouse he's having a hard time getting his power to generate enough force to knock all of the arrows off course. And they're in such a tight confinement that even when they are blown off course, oftentimes they still, maybe they're a little bit off the mark, but they still strike one of the soldiers, and it's just not proving to be as effective in an enclosed area. So they're desperately trying to fight their way out of this mess, and Adele is attacked several times by Hoyt fighters and has to defend himself. Ends up at one point in a pretty nasty situation where one of the Hoyt manages to tackle him to the ground and is just beating him mercilessly. But Ola sees what's happening and manages to save him. Absolutely brutally kills the guy. One of my favorite it's one of my favorite scenes of combat, because it's just, I won't divulge the details here, but it's rather brutal the way Ola puts this guy down. And I don't necessarily enjoy writing the violent scenes, but when I feel I've done a good job with them, it it's a good feeling to feel that I've created a sense of realism, that maybe the reader can feel a little bit of what the characters are feeling. Like, for example, in this scene when Adele's nose is broken, I want you to feel that broken nose just a little bit. But despite Ola saving Adele, the fight is not going well. The soldiers are dying quickly. Alce is running around the warehouse trying to get at these Hoyt archers that are inside the walls, and ends up getting shot. While doing so, she gets hit just below the ribs and falls over, and then another arrow comes for her and almost hits her in the head as she falls. If she hadn't been falling while the arrow was fired, she probably would have been killed. And this just pushes Adele over the edge. He realizes, we're screwed, I have to do something or we're all going to die. And he calls back to one of his lessons in the temple where Elam took him outside in a thunderstorm and had him try to redirect lightning bolts and blow them in a different direction, essentially. And he remembered Elam telling him, in time maybe you could even form your own, but that's a really advanced thing. That's something that takes years to master. But he knows that there's nothing they can do short of completely destroying the warehouse that's going to get them out of this situation. So he decides in that split second he's going to try it. And he succeeds, although it's far more intense than he ever could have imagined. Just the sound of the blast hitting the warehouse, and it's just pure chaos. The whole place going up in flames and smoke everywhere. And he's trying to get to Alce against the wall before the whole building burns down. But he's, keep in mind, still relatively new to his power. And as you can imagine, this type of attack consumes a large amount of energy. So he's basically collapsing as he's trying to get across the warehouse to her. And Ola saves him again. He gets to Alce and picks her up and carries her out, drags Adele back to his feet and forces him along as well. Fortunately, the lightning blast blew the building open enough to where they were able to exit, at least those who had survived that long. And they stumble back out into the night, and it doesn't really feel like a victory to anyone. They did not get Idanox, though they did kill some of the Hoyt. It ends up being a rather hollow victory because they lost a lot of their soldiers, and in the end it resonates like a rather brutal defeat. It was important to me to show that Adele isn't invincible, that his power doesn't have no limits at all whatsoever. So when he comes in initially and his windshield is ineffective in the confined area, that was a method of doing that, to show, okay, they didn't take his power away, but they were able to find a way to limit its effectiveness against them. And in the end, in order to get them out of there, he had to put together this really ridiculous attack that he wasn't even sure he was capable of doing, and ends up burning the whole warehouse down. Really, by doing that, he put a lot of their lives in danger, but it was just the only answer that he had available to him. So he's going to have to deal with the ramifications of what's happened there going forward, and he's going to have to accept some of his own limitations and realize that he doesn't always have the answers going forward. He's still relatively new at what he's doing, and there are going to be times where those weaknesses are going to show themselves. So chapter 19 picks up the next day, and it's a much calmer chapter after what happened in chapter 18. But Adele and Alcé are in an inn that General MacLeod has provided them after the assault on the warehouse failed spectacularly. Ola is with them as well, but he's gone out and he's always kind of paranoid, so he's sweeping the streets nearby looking for any sign that the Hoi are coming after them, although they're pretty confident that their location is a secret for the time being. Alcé's wounds have been treated by a healer, and Adele's just waiting for her to wake up, which of course she does, or it wouldn't be much of a scene or chapter otherwise, would it? And so they sort of have a chance to resume their conversation that was interrupted a few chapters ago by General Byrne, where Adele gets to learn a little bit more about her past. He's still curious about how someone his own age has been working for the children of the Rawl for as long as Alcé has. And she reveals that a lot like him, she had been through some trauma in her younger life, even younger than him. She had been the daughter of a traveling merchant when she was about 8 years old, I believe I said. And she and her father were ambushed by bandits in the countryside, and this was before the time of the Hoyt, but she even says to herself, these are the type of guys that probably would have joined them. And they stole all of their goods, and as they were departing, they killed her father for good measure, and left her alone in the wilderness, just an 8-year-old girl, unable to fend for herself. But she certainly tried, and she was a survivor, and she wandered off on her own, trying her best to find safety, determined that she would not let them win. And quite unwittingly, she ended up close to the temple of the Rawl, where Clawak the giant found her and took her to the temple. And the children took her in and raised her, and Ola played a part in that as well, raising her, and he went out and buried her father's body for her. And he taught her how to fight and taught her a lot of what she knows about how to survive on her own. And Adele is just floored by her story and is amazed at the strength of her managing to survive all of this at such a young age. And then, as you might expect a 16-year-old to do, he goes off on an angsty rant about how everything that's gone wrong is his fault, about how she's been placed in danger because of him, and she promptly shuts him down and explains that she has no regrets about following him, that she's more certain than ever that she was right to do so, and that they are fighting for a just cause, and that what's happened to her in the past only strengthens that belief, because she wants to spare other people from going through what she's gone through. And it really sort of echoes what goes on in Adele's own head. And I wanted to show that without that part of it doesn't even really occur to him, that their thought process is so similar, but it is meant to be shown to the reader how alike they are. He doesn't really look at it that way because he's too busy blaming himself for everything that's gone wrong, as someone his age in this situation is likely to do. But he does manage to move past it a bit with her help and her reinforcement that they are doing the right thing, and that they do need to put an end to the Hoyt, that the longer these conflicts continue, the more people are going to suffer, and the more people are going to end up like them. And so even though they've sort of had this kick in the teeth from what happened at the warehouse, The chapter and their part of this story, this is the last chapter that features them, really ends on a bit of a high note. And Adele's even saying, you know what, yeah, they got us this time, but their days are numbered. We're going to go get these bastards. We're going to take care of this. They're they don't know what's coming for them. Which brings us into the final chapter of the book, chapter 20, which takes place from Idanox's point of view, and Idanox is thinking very similar thoughts. These bastards don't know what's coming for them. He's tired of Adele's interference. He's extremely angry about what happened in the warehouse. His plan had been to kill Adele and Supreme General McLeod in one go, and it completely failed because of Adele's power. And he's so frustrated by Adele's power because he hasn't been able to find a way around it. And that's why he's brought in somebody new. And I mentioned early on in this podcast, mages. And he has called on a mage who has been expelled from the Order of Mages, which is the governing body of mages in the Empire. And he has brought this man in named Srenpe, and he is looking for answers. He's looking for a way around the power of the Rawl. He's looking for a way to rid himself of Adele. He believes that Adele is probably the greatest threat to his goals, and he needs him gone. Now, this mage Srenpe plays a much larger role in the next book. It's more so just a cameo appearance here at the end of this book. And it's a character I really enjoyed writing in the second book. I'm not going to get into that too much, but he's a lot of fun. And one of the reasons he's a lot of fun is he has a certain amount of disdain for Idanox. He thinks he's vain, he thinks he's a bit of an idiot, and he has no problem showing it. But at the same time, he very much wants the money that Idanox is offering him in exchange for his services. So chapter 20 details their negotiations, and Idanox ultimately wants to know what Srenpe's plan is to eliminate Adele. And the mage clearly states, this is going to take a few weeks for me to make certain preparations. And winter is beginning to fall on this extremely northern province. And think of winter in Thornata as winter in Canada or North Dakota or any northern type climate. It is harsh, it's brutal, it's hard to move around. And so by accepting this deal, Idanox is basically accepting that he's not going to be able to kill Adele until winter has begun to break. But he feels it's a small price to pay, although the financial price that Srenpe demands is quite high. And so they come to this agreement that Srenpe will perform some sort of magic that will eliminate Adele in exchange for payment, and Idanox accepts. And even though he's somewhat nervous about the type of arrangement he's getting himself into, he feels that ultimately the ends will be worth the means that he has to go through to get there. So the book concludes with Idanox quite gleeful, just not all that different from Adele was in his last chapter, thinking to himself, well, this is it. I'm finally going to get rid of this annoying little kid, and then nobody's going to be able to stand in my way. And that is how the book concludes. I'm not going to go any further because then we'd be diving into the second book, The Throne of Thornata. And that might be an episode for another time, if anyone wants to hear that. If anyone wants to hear my thoughts on that writing process, I would be happy to sit down and record something like this for it. Just let me know in the comments down below. So that brings us to the end of the book and toward the end of the episode here. Did you enjoy this? I know I said at the beginning that I really enjoy talks like this where writers sit down and discuss their work and talk a little bit about what they were thinking when they wrote certain things. And so I hope you found this at least a little bit enjoyable. If you have, please hit that thumbs up button. Leave a comment talking about what you liked, what you didn't like. Were you thinking the same things that I was thinking when you read the book? I'd love to hear from you. I haven't put all of this episode together yet at the time of sitting down and saying this, but I'm sure it is going to end up being quite long. So thank you to anyone who was interested enough to sit down and listen to all of this. It does mean a lot, and I would assume that means you probably read the book, or maybe you were reading along, and I really appreciate your support. So thank you very much. We'll be back with another episode soon, probably a more traditional one instead of one of these really, really long ramblings. Although, like I said, if you are interested in another one of these in regards to the second book, please let me know. I would love to make it for you. I just need to know that the interest is there. If you have any comments, questions, feedback, topic suggestions, the website is petebeal.com. It's linked in the description below. There's a little form you can fill out, submit anything you want to me, and I will get back to you probably on the podcast. I'd love to answer questions or comments here on the podcast. Also, always accepting guests if anyone wants to come on and talk about their work, whether you be an author, editor, cover designer, publisher, whoever you are, I'd love to sit down and talk to you. So, petebeal.com, linked down below. Once again, if you like the content, please hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing. You should have a little red button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and you will be notified when I release new episodes or new content. Would love to have you as a subscriber. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed the book if you read it. Until next time, please stay safe, stay healthy, stay creative, and always keep writing. Thank you very much.